Man has a real desire in most cases, and I know that there are probably exceptions to this rule as there is to every other rule, not to really stand out and to kind of blend into society. And as a result of that, sometimes we have people who compromise their faith because they don't want to appear too different. Well, I think we're going to talk about something tonight that has really kind of fallen into that category. Before we begin to discuss the specific title of our lesson, I want to remind you of something, or to tell you something that you might not have thought of. I can remember that when I was in science classes in 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade, that I began to notice in the textbooks that there were statements made, in particularly those sections that dealt with the idea of the evolutionary process of life to lead to man's existence, that the world, as according to the testimony at that time, was in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 million years old. That was a statement that was pretty commonly made. Well, over a period of time, I think scientists began to realize that they were advancing an idea that was so improbable that, in fact, it was pretty much impossible. And so consequently, over a period of time, that began to creep up. And I began to notice that when scientists would be on television, as I began to be noticing such things, that they would speak of the earth in billions of years. And first I remember hearing the word 3 to 5 billion years old. And then I remember a few years ago that number had climbed, and I heard some scientists on television talking about the earth being about 15 billion years old. And then I was reading a book not too long ago in which Stephen Hawking was quoted as saying that the earth was eternal, that time was actually kind of a fiction, and that it actually, the earth, or at least the universe, had always existed, and the earth came about during that time, but the point is that it had always been there. And the reason that that's true is something that's pretty easily definable, and we're going to talk about that and the consequence of it a little bit this evening. Now, sometimes people will say, why would you discuss something such as this? But I think the reason is this. Especially if you're older, like myself, you're pretty fixed. And when people say things that are just completely off the wall, you just kind of let them, as we sometimes say, roll off of you like water off a duck's back. But you have to realize that when people are very young and they're in a situation where they're in a classroom somewhere, or they're listening to people that they think of as being very intelligent people make statements, and when they keep making the same statement over and over and over again, then over a period of time they just kind of begin to assume that it's true. And so we have things that sometimes we just have society accept as truth without any real evidence demonstrated to prove that it is. We kind of assume that man has always thought of the earth as being 15 billion years or maybe eternal. And we kind of lose sight of the fact that there's a reason for that. Some people will say, well, what difference does it make? Why even talk about that? Well, there is a reason to talk about it, because this is something that has come into existence for a specific reason. Now, one of the things that we have to realize that Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul said that we need to be careful that we are not ignorant of Satan's devices. Because if we're ignorant of why people do things, sometimes we become duped by them. And Satan has been able to snow a lot of people by making them not really understand this argument that says, what difference does it make? We just kind of don't challenge it because it doesn't matter to us and we don't really care. But let's stop and think about it. And I'll ask a question. What is the age of the earth? And it's an interesting question, But it's a question that we cannot answer. But there are some things that we do know, and there's some things we don't know, and we need to pay attention to them because they have an impact upon our faith, and they have an impact upon the faith of others. And that's what we need to sometimes consider. One of the reasons that people shy away from this subject is because if you begin to, I don't know if you've ever tried to read a textbook, but I put it this way. Several years ago, I was preaching a series of lessons on evolution, and I had one of the members of the church there had just graduated from college. I've told this story before, but she'd loaned me a bunch of her textbooks. Well, they were not overly beneficial to me because my level of expertise wasn't sufficient to be able to understand what was being stated. So we sometimes kind of get intimidated, and we don't want to say anything about things that really do make a difference because we think, well, we're just not in a position to do so. So we're going to stay on a simple level because that's where I am, and I assume that's where you are for the most part, and ask you the question, what do we know? When we ask the question, what is the age of the earth? Let's ask this question, what do we know? A lot of people don't stop to think about this. You hear all the time, in this modern deal with COVID, you hear it all the time, this idea of follow the science. And sometimes people don't really know what the definition of science is. Science is simply means knowledge. That's what it means. Knowledge is something that is impossible to be assailed. In other words, it's something that is true, and there's no other explanation than that one. And that's what knowledge actually is, and that's what these people are claiming that they're following is that science. But you can listen to the different people and realize that that's not a settled science, obviously, by any stretch of the imagination. And when you look at the age of the earth, you've got the same problem. Just remember that if I go back in my lifetime about 60 years, and people are teaching the earth is 45 to 50 million years old, and then I jump up to the present time and people have expanded that to say, well, we don't even know if it had a beginning, it may have been eternal, then you know that both of those statements can't be true. So this is something that's up in the air. And it hasn't been changed because of new discoveries. That's not what's changed our thinking. What's changed our thinking is a realization of something that we're going to point out as we go along. Here's what we know. We know the earth exists. You know that? I know that. Everyone knows that. That is an established fact that cannot be questioned in any way whatsoever. From a scientific viewpoint, the earth is a reality. That we know. We know that it predates all living creatures. Why do we know that? Because all living creatures are dependent upon the earth for their existence. And if there was no earth, they wouldn't have an existence. You and I, every one of us, we need certain things. We need air to breathe, we need water to drink, and we need food to eat. And this earth that we live on provides those things, and without them, we could not exist. And so therefore, we know that the earth had to come into existence before we came into existence, simply because we are dependent upon it. And that's true of every other living creature of whatever species they might be. We know, therefore, that no one was there when the world began. Why is that important? Well, when God was talking to Job and he made that statement that we've read so many times there in Job 38, he didn't say that, as my father used to say, just to hear his head rattle. He had a purpose. He was saying it for a reason. And what he was saying to Job is this. When you think of science, then it is an established fact. Well, we know the earth exists. Why? Well, it's pretty obvious. But then there's another question that comes into mind. If we ask the question, when did it begin, and we're trying to answer that, then here's the problem. Since we know that the earth predates all creatures, including mankind, then we know the answer to this question. God asked Job a question, which was a rhetorical question, suggested its own answer, which we know the answer to this question. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? God asked Job. Now, I'm going to answer that question for you. I know the answer to that question 100%. Neither I nor any other human being existed. Period. We did not. And therefore, we cannot testify and say, I saw the earth being created. I saw it come into existence. I saw the accidental process that brought it to pass, or whatever we're going to say that happened. We can't say it because we weren't there. He said, where were you? Declare, if thou hast understanding. If you know all the answers, this just tell me that you were there, that you observed it, and therefore you can tell me from an eyewitness perspective of what happened. That's what God's saying to Job. You know, many times passages like this are said to man for a reason. And you can really understand it when you look down to verse 21. God asked Job the question. He said, knowest thou it because thou wast then born? Now think about what he said. Do you know it because you were there? Or because the number of days is great? That because you've lived so long, you've been able to go back to the beginning of time, and have you seen it all? Do you know? Can you answer the question from that perspective? And the answer, of course, is no. We can't do that. Now, when you stop and you think about this, about what we do know, we know that it's not a matter to be dealt with by scientific method. We can't do it. Now, God just dealt with half of that scientific equation, if you please. Half of it is, what is science anyway? If you're talking about science, what is science? Well, science means that you're talking about something that you've either observed, you know it to be true because you observed it, or you're talking about something that you know the process through which it is accomplished, and you can reproduce the process and therefore reproduce the outcome. That's what an experiment is in a laboratory. You simply reproduce the process so that you demonstrate how it occurred. Now let me ask you a question. You stop and think about it. When you think about the universe that we live in, God's already answered one of the questions for you. Where were you when it happened? Could you observe it? And the answer, of course, is no. The second question would fall into place. Okay, well, you weren't there. So if this is a scientific discussion, then now what we've got to do is we've got to produce an experiment through which we create the same circumstances which existed at the beginning of time, which we don't know what they were. And we're going to have to create those circumstances, and we're going to have to demonstrate through a process and reproduce that which occurred. So we're going to have to reproduce the universe by experimentation, and we can't do it. So therefore, this is not a scientific question. People need to realize it. Christians do not need to be intimidated into letting people push on them an idea that's not true. This is not a scientific question. It cannot be answered from a scientific perspective, period. And you say, what difference does that make? We'll get to that in a few moments. What do we not know? What is it that we don't know? Well, we don't know how long ago it began. That's what we don't know. When we look at this earth and we talk about the age of it, we don't have any idea. I mean, there's no way that we can know that. It's impossible. We're talking about something that's just absolutely impossible. We do know this. This is one of the things we do know that tells us what we don't know. All right, we're talking about 60 years ago, they were saying 45 to 50 million years ago, the age of being the age of the earth. And now they're saying maybe 15 billion years and maybe eternally. We don't really know, we're told. What we do know is this. Recorded history goes back 10,000 years, approximately, give or take a little. That'd be pretty close to right. Somewhere between, 7 and 10. It's really hard to say exactly when the first record of any history was. I don't know. But let's think about this. Recorded history goes back about 10,000 years, approximately. Now, here's what we know, what we do know. We know it went back 10,000 years, but here's something that's true. We know that at the time that recorded history began, that everything was pretty much as it is right now. That's the truth. When you go to the book of Ecclesiastes, now I want to read verse 1 through 10 because it's very critical to read it. I mean, sometimes people think, well, why would you talk about such a thing? Because it's important to understand the limitation of man when we begin to deal with things that are beyond our pay grade, the trouble we can get ourselves in. Because we need to understand why folks are trying to push this idea back. Why are they trying to establish 15 billion or eternal for the age of the earth? And you got to think about that, which we'll do in a few minutes. But let's kind of reach a point to say that we don't really know the time first. Go back in recorded history. Here's what the book of Ecclesiastes said. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What he means is, as he goes on to describe, the earth kind of progresses, but it's always pretty much the same. What profit hath a man of all his labor which is taken under the sun? One generation passeth away, another generation cometh. Been doing that now for somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 to 10,000 years, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also arises, the sun goeth down, hasteth to his place where he arose. The wind goeth toward the south, turneth about to the north. It whirls about continually, and the wind returneth according to his circuits. Now, when he wrote that, he was writing that by inspiration. You and I can identify that today scientifically, by the way. You ever look at a map, a weather map on television, radar, and you look at how it occurs? I mean, you can actually see from outer space exactly what he's telling you. Has anything changed in your lifetime? I say to people sometimes, if the wind comes out of the east, then you need to pay attention because something bad about to happen. And here's the truth. Wind goes toward the south, turns about the north, and it does that in the same way, and it's always coming pretty much kind of from the west and coming toward the east, not going from the east back to the west. That's just the way it always is. He said that whirleth about continually. Theoretically, if you placed a speck of dust in the atmosphere here, eventually it would return, is what he's telling you. And he's right. And wind turneth again according to his circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, but the sea's not full. How long has that been going on? Ever since man has recorded any history. He's known that to be true. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. Now, there was a time we didn't understand all the whys and the wherefores of that. Now we understand it pretty clearly because of scientific discovery. But he then goes on to say, all things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with the seeing, nor the ear filled with the hearing. The thing that hath been is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there's no new thing under the sun. Everything's pretty much the same today as it was when history began to be recorded as much as 10,000 years ago. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. I've said many, many times, when you look at this world, all knowledge was here in the beginning of time. And you stop and you think, does man ever create any new knowledge? No. All man does is discover what already was, which is exactly what Solomon said. We don't create anything new. Everything is simply a discovery process, and that's what's been taking place since the beginning of time. All right, the question is then, if we're trying to determine how old the earth is, then what we need to realize is, if we go back as far as man is capable of going back with any means of observation, everything is the same as it now is. So it doesn't really help us, does it? So that doesn't help us a great deal in understanding how old the earth is. We don't know how long the earth was in existence before intelligent creatures began to record its history. That we don't know. We know that since we began to record history, everything's pretty much the same and nothing has really changed to any great degree. We know that. But what we don't know is what happened before that. And so all of a sudden, remember what God said to Job, all of a sudden we're in that position of saying, okay, we don't have any real scientific knowledge of that. It's beyond us. Scientifically, from a scientific viewpoint, what we know to be true, everything today is pretty much as it has always been since the beginning of recorded history. That we know. Beyond that, we don't know. Now let's stop and think. Anything that tries to account for the beginning, that is, beginning of the universe, has to be a matter of speculation. We've just had a major murder trial that ended in this area. Most of us are probably pretty much convinced that the right verdict was reached, and that's true. But in that murder trial, was there any physical evidence at all? Best I could tell, not really. Wasn't much there. Was there any eyewitness testimony? No. And so what did they convict the person with? Well, they presented evidence to the jury, and you know what it ultimately amounted to in the jury's mind? They had faith that that's what happened. That's what it amounted to. They looked at the evidence and they reached a certain belief pattern, and that pointed to the fact that the man was guilty of murder. It was, as they sometimes say, circumstantial evidence. Well, just remember that everything that you see when you go back to the beginning of time is circumstantial evidence. That's all it is. There's no real physical evidence at all because there wasn't anybody there, and you can't reproduce it by experimentation. So consequently, what does it mean? It means that when a scientist tells you that the earth is 15 billion years old, or maybe he stretches that a little further and says the earth had no real beginning, it's eternal, that's a matter of faith with him. He cannot prove that. That's impossible. It is beyond the realm of possibility for him to prove that, or her to prove that, with any type of scientific method. It just simply cannot be done. Or, if we put that another way, we're really in an area of faith, and we're not in the area of science. We're just not. When people keep saying, you're just denying the science. Show me somebody who saw it happen. Show me someone who reproduced it in the laboratory, and I'll tell you that it was science. Otherwise, it falls in the area of faith. And we need to understand how important that is. Why is it that people are trying to make the age of the earth unfathomable? Let me ask you a question. Can you fathom 15 billion years? I mean, can you really just imagine that? Everybody looks at me and says, that's an old man. Okay, I'm an old man. How old am I? 73. Be 74 in September. How does that compare to 15 billion? Put 74 over 15 billion and look at what that fraction is. It's about the equivalent of a drop of water in a 50-gallon drum. It really is almost insignificant. My life in the overall view of 15 billion would be an insignificant particle that meant basically nothing. So we can't conceive of it. I mean, we're talking about something that's just unfathomable. It's just beyond our conception. It's kind of like all this modern debt that we have when they start talking about trillions. And boy, when you get to trillions, you really can't fathom that. I've wondered why they hadn't just gone on and pushed it out to trillions of years instead of billions, because that makes it even easier to say what they're trying to explain. But all they're really trying to do is to push something to the point that it's unfathomable. And let's think about that just a little bit. If you believe that God created the earth, you don't have to make the earth billions of years old. How old was the earth when Adam was created? That's a question I can't answer. The morning and the evening of the first day he's talking about when light came into existence. When that was, I don't know. How long the earth existed before that, I don't know. Maybe the earth is 15 billion years. I don't have any clue. I don't have any way of knowing. But I do know this. I know it doesn't have to be for my faith in God that says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, because at whatever point I go back, be it 10,000, be it 50 million, be it 15 billion, be it 30 trillion, as our national debt is now. If it went back 30 trillion years, when I got back there, as a believer in God, God created the heavens and the earth. How long did it take it to come into existence? You know, you stop and you think about this situation. If you're trying to account for something that's statistically impossible, you know, statistics are an interesting thing. I read something many, many years ago, back in the 80s, that statistics were first beginning to be something that people thought a lot about, and they began to create computers that could figure things statistically, and so we do them today. That's how you come up with the probability of you getting killed in an airplane or a car wreck or cancer killing you or whatever, is you feed all the information in, and then the computer tells you what the statistical probability of you dying from that would be. I think getting struck by lightning is what, 1 in so many 100,000, I'm not sure. But statistics figure that. So they put in all this information about the statistical probability of the earth coming into existence without any known force causing it. Do you know what the statistical probability was? 0. And modern statistical computers still render the same answer. If you take any of the things that people are trying to explain, and they'll say, what's the statistical probability of it happening, of the conditions being such that the earth suddenly, and the planets and the sun and all the stars and all the rotations and everything coming out in exactly the way it did, what's the probability? And it would tell you nothing. Couldn't happen. It's statistically impossible. Now, if you're trying to account for something statistically impossible, you only have one haven, one place you can go. You need to obscure the obvious, the implausibility of the occurrence that you're trying to describe, that is, it came about accidentally, with eons of time. Because why? Because we can't fathom that. We can't think about that. Why do you think that they keep pushing the time out further? Why do you think that's true? Because people are looking at that and saying, from the beginning of time, everything's been like it is now. It had to have a beginning, and everything had to kind of begin at the same time. It couldn't be through an evolutionary process or some kind of a situation where the earth just kind of went through all these millions and millions of years of change. It couldn't happen because everything had to kind of come to place exactly right, exactly the right time. And that kind of tells you that, hey, this wasn't an accidental process. So the so-called scientists, Paul refers to them as science falsely so-called scientists, they say, you know, you're right. Statistically, it's impossible. I can't fathom it. So I'll just push enough time into it and say, given enough time, anything is possible. When you begin with the conception that this very complex universe in which we live and the ecosystem that we have on this earth all occurred accidentally. You ever think about that? You ever think about what would be required for that to happen? You ever occur to you what would have to happen? Everything in this world, and what amazes me is I have scientists talking about this all the time. I saw a story about turtles this morning. How important they are to the ecosystem, what an important part that they play. And everything has to be there for the ecosystem to work. And yet we're told it took 15 billion years to come from point A to point B. And during that period of time, you didn't have some of these things. So how did it actually work? And the answer is, we don't know. So don't let somebody snowball you and try to force you to say, well, it had to be true because after all, it was given enough time, anything can happen. I've used this illustration so many times I don't remember, but I'm going to give you a challenge. I'm going to give you a challenge, and you try it. See how it works out for you. Get you 10 pennies. and take a magic marker and write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on them. Put them in your pocket. Stick your hand in there and jiggle them around and pull one penny out. It has to be number 1. Stick your hand back in there and jiggle it around and pull another one out. It has to be number 2. And you keep doing that till you get 1 through 10. Now remember this, that every time that you pull out number 3 when you should have pulled out number 2, then that upsets the process, so you've got to start it over again. Put them all back in your pocket, and you've got to be able to bring them out of your pocket. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What do you think the statistical probability of that would be? Could it happen? You know, it probably would eventually. It'd probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 in 300,000 or 1 in 500,000, something like that. Considering the odds you have of the Powerball and winning the lottery, it'd probably be about that. But just remember something. Do you know how many things would have to be true in the universe that we live in? Do you know the number of things that would... You wouldn't have 1 through 10. I don't know what you'd have. You'd have a number so high that I don't know that we have enough decimals to record the number of things that would have to happen in an exact sequence in order for just the world to come into existence, much less all the living creatures we have on it. So just don't let anybody snowball you and try to make you believe, well, you know, you're just crazy. We talked about in Hosea how people say you're strange when you believe what God said. I believe that God created the heavens and the earth. Now, let me tell you something. Why is the age of the earth of no concern to the Bible believer? Why do I not really care? Why am I arguing the point? I don't care what it is. But I don't have to have a long life. I don't have to have 15 billion years. The person who doesn't believe in God, who looks at the universe as it exists, which he knows exists because he's here, he observes that, and he knows it's here, he has to have it because the improbability of it is such. Now let's think about it. I'm going to read 31 verses. Try to read them pretty quickly. The age of the earth is of no concern to the Bible believer because we believe that an intelligent being created everything instantly. How long did it take for God to create the heavens and the earth? Well, He created the earth, and let's just read what it says. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void, darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness He called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. So that's the division. When that light was created, we began to count time. Until that, we didn't. Once that was created, we began to count time. From the time that He began to count time, then we began in verse 6. Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters, and make the firmament, and divided the waters which are under the firmament from the waters which are above the firmament. And it was so, and God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so, and God called the dry land earth, and He gathered together the waters, called the seas, which, by the way, exist today as they always have. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven, divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, for seasons, for days and years. Sun and moon, obviously. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven, to give light upon the earth. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the sun, the lesser light to rule the night. And lesser, by the way, is a word that doesn't mean smaller. What it means is basically something that reflects the brilliance of another, which the moon, of course, does. It doesn't actually have any light, it just reflects the light of the sun. And He made the stars also, and God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth, and the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after his kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters and the seas, let fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day. And God said, let the earth bring forth a living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, beasts of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in the which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat, talking to man. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every herb for meat. And it was so. In other words, all animals are dependent upon vegetation for their existence, which God created first. And God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day, or the 6th day. The heavens and the earth were finished in 6 days. So we as a Christian, we don't care about the time. When that occurred, I don't care. Doesn't matter to me. My faith is not dependent upon 15 billion years for it to have any legitimacy at all. But the person who claims that the earth came about accidentally and all life forms came about accidentally is in a position where he has to have the time. You don't have to have the time. He does. And that's why it's pushed. So you say, well, listen, it doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't matter except to understand why people are saying it. Why are they insisting it has to be so? It's a matter of faith with them because it's the only means by which they can explain without a direct creative act the existence of all things. And we need to understand that. Since we believe that God spake things into existence as they are, then eons of time for improbable changes to occur wasn't needed. Didn't need the eons of time. I don't need it. I don't really care how old the earth is. It doesn't matter to me at all. I don't care if it's 10,000 years, if it's 10 million years, if it's 10 billion years, or 10 trillion years. It doesn't bother me. Why? Well, because Hebrews 11 says this. Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. You know, there's one thing that has always been interesting to me. When people are arguing about the fact that God couldn't exist, and they keep saying that matter is eternal, is it more probable to believe that there was a God that brought matter into existence by the word of his mouth? Or is it more probable to believe that matter is something that is eternal? And if you go back to look at Einstein's theory, you know that he doesn't believe matter is eternal. He believes it has a lifespan that's going to cease one day. And he's right. He said, through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. There was a point in time when everything suddenly came to be. That's what the Scripture says. And that's what we need to understand. Whenever it began, God was the cause. I have confidence in that. I just don't want people to browbeat our young folks into accepting the idea that because the earth is 15 billion years old, it had time to develop. Because even if you did that, you still have to explain where it came from, which you cannot do. So you're in a position whether you either have to believe that God existed eternally or matter exists eternally. And we know from a scientific viewpoint, matter does not exist eternally. We know that even if you talk about uranium has a a half-life, and you're talking about how long it's going to exist before it becomes lead. And all other things, they tend to have, they're not something that lasts forever. They're things that have a shelf life, if you please. This earth has a shelf life. And only the fool ignores that. A person, I don't mean fool in the way of calling somebody a name. I mean a person who doesn't consider the facts is the only person that can say, well, if you just give me enough time, I could make it happen. And therefore your faith in God is foolishness. And that's really what's happening. So I've thought about this a lot. I know that some folks sometimes don't like to sit through a lesson like this. They feel like it's a waste of time. But just remember this. The Satan would like to destroy your faith in God. And one of the quickest ways to do that is to demonstrate to you in his mind that God doesn't exist. And it's a foolish idea. And one of the easiest ways to do that is try to get you to see that, hey, this all came about accidentally. There was no cause for it. You need to stop and think about it. I hope that it's been somewhat profitable to you. Just give it some thought. Just think about it. And as we close this lesson, I realize that we've not preached first principles at all. We just talked about some things that the world's trying to push on us that we need to be careful about. Could they be right? I don't know. Does it matter? No. Because whenever you set the beginning of time, whatever that time is, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and time began at that point. And time did not exist before that point. And that's what we need to realize. That's what we need to understand. But that means there's an all-powerful God that's responsible for our existence. And therefore he dictates and determines how our existence shall continue, because he's predetermined we're made in his image, so we're not going to die for eternity. So we're going to exist somewhere. We make the decision as to where, whether we obey him or whether we don't. And that's the decision that we have to make, and think about that as together we stand as we sing.